My parents told me, "You'll never make it without us," so I left, and made them come crawling back. It happened on a Tuesday night. The kind of night that doesn't look like it should change anything, the dinner table set, the usual clatter of plates, the faint hum of the television in the other room. But that night, the air was thick with something unspoken, the tension heavy enough that even the simplest question, "Pass the salt?" felt sharp. I'd been living with them longer than I planned to. After college, after the first few years of working, it seemed easier to stay, or maybe they made it easier. Rent-free, dinners waiting, the constant safety net of "just come home, we'll help." It sounded generous. It sounded loving. But there's a difference between being helped and being held. That night, I brought up leaving again. I'd been thinking about getting my own place for months. Saving money. Looking at tiny apartments online, imagining a key that was only mine. "I think I'm ready," I said, pushing food around my plate. "I've been looking at a few places. Nothing big, but..." My father didn't even look up from his plate. "You can't afford it." My mother didn't pause her fork. "You don't have the discipline." I tried to keep my voice calm. "I've been saving. I have enough for a deposit. I just think it's time." They exchanged one of those glances, the kind that lasted only a second but said everything. Then my father set his fork down and looked at me the way he always did when he was about to say something final. "You'll never make it without us." He didn't shout. He didn't say it with anger. He said it with absolute certainty, like he was telling me the weather, or stating my birth date. My mother didn't correct him. She nodded, her voice softer but no less sharp. "We're the only reason you've made it this far. You leave, and you'll come crawling back." I stared at my plate, the peas and chicken and potatoes blurring in front of me. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, the kind that comes when you're humiliated but don't want them to see it. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Because in that second, something shifted inside me. It wasn't anger, not the kind that makes you scream and slam doors. It wasn't sadness either, not the heavy kind that makes you curl up and cry. It was something quieter. Something harder. Because they weren't warning me. They were daring me. All those years of "we know what's best," all those times they made every choice feel like it wasn't mine, it all led to this sentence. "You'll never make it without us." They didn't see how those words landed. How they burned. How they lit something I didn't even know was there. I looked up, met my father's eyes, then my mother's. And I smiled. Not out of agreement. But because I knew, right then and there, they'd made the biggest mistake of their lives. Shall I continue with part 2, 600+ words, where she starts to sit with those words? That night, I didn't slam my bedroom door. I didn't stomp down the hallway or fire back with the kind of angry words that leave you both hurting. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed, their voices still echoing in my head. "You'll never make it without us." It wasn't the first time they'd said something like that, not really. Over the years, they had dropped smaller versions of that same idea into casual conversations. "Are you sure you can handle that? We just don't think you're ready for the real world. You don't know how hard it is out there." I had let those words slide. Every single time. I told myself they were just worried. That it was their way of protecting me. That they didn't mean for their doubt to feel like chains. But that night? There was no hiding from what they really meant. They didn't believe in me. Not even a little. They didn't see me as an adult, or even as someone capable of standing on my own. They saw me as an extension of them. Something they could keep. I stared at the half-packed box in the corner of my room, the one I'd started filling weeks ago with books, old mugs, and a framed photo I didn't even like but kept anyway. I hadn't told them I was packing. I wasn't sure I'd go through with it. But now, looking at that box, I realized something. I wasn't packing to move. I was packing to escape. For years, they had made leaving sound impossible. They didn't scream or threaten, that wasn't their way. They used softer weapons. Guilt. Doubt. Phrases like, "We're only trying to help," that felt less like comfort and more like warning. And I had believed them. I had stayed, long past the point when it was good for me, because I thought maybe they were right, maybe I wasn't ready. But sitting there that night, staring at that box, I felt something shift. I replayed every moment they guided me by holding me back. The job I almost took but didn't because they said it was too far. The trips I didn't go on because they told me it wasn't safe. The relationships they nudged me out of, insisting they weren't good enough for you, but deep down, I knew the truth, no one would ever be good enough for them. I thought of all the ways I had made myself smaller, quieter, easier, just to keep the peace. And then I thought of that one sentence. "You'll never make it without us." It wasn't just a dismissal. It was a challenge. I went to the closet and pulled out a suitcase I hadn't used in years. I set it on the bed and unzipped it. The sound was louder than it should have been, sharp and final in the quiet room. I wasn't just going to leave anymore. I was going to make it. I didn't know how. I didn't know how long it would take, or how many nights I'd cry myself to sleep wondering if I'd made the right choice. But I knew this. I'd rather fail on my own than succeed by staying under their thumb. Because the moment they said those words, they stopped being my safety net. And they became the reason I needed to jump. I didn't announce it the next morning. I didn't storm into the kitchen and declare, "I'm leaving." There was no shouting match, no slammed plates, no dramatic exit like the kind you see in movies. That wasn't the way this needed to happen. Instead, I woke up early, earlier than they ever did, and I started packing. Not the half-hearted kind of packing I'd been doing before, tossing things in a box just in case. This was different. This was deliberate. I folded clothes slowly, neatly. I wrapped mugs in old newspapers, lined books in a suitcase, slid framed photos between layers of sweaters so the glass wouldn't break. Every sound, the zip of the suitcase, the thud of shoes dropping into a bag, felt louder than it should have, like the house itself was listening. By the time my parents woke up, there were 3 bags by the door. My mother came into the kitchen, still tying her robe. "What's all this?" I didn't look up from the coffee I was pouring. "I'm leaving." She laughed. Not in a cruel way, but in that disbelieving way she always did when she thought I was joking, or when she thought I'd change my mind. "You'll be back in a week," she said, waving her hand. My father came in next, his footsteps heavy, his face already frowning. "What's this nonsense?" he asked, glancing at the bags. "It's not nonsense," I said, my voice steady. "I'm leaving. Today." He didn't yell. He didn't stop me. He just looked at me with that same quiet certainty he'd used the night before, the same tone he'd had when he'd said the words that started all this. "You won't make it," he said. "You'll see." I nodded once. "Maybe I will," I said. "But I'd rather find out for myself than let you keep telling me who I am." I picked up the first bag. Neither of them reached for it. Neither of them told me to stay. They just stood there, certain I'd be back soon enough. And that was the part that stung the most, not anger, not even sadness, but that quiet, unshakable belief that I couldn't possibly do it. That I couldn't survive without them. I didn't argue anymore. I didn't plead for them to believe in me. I simply opened the door, stepped outside, and let the cold air hit my face like a slap of reality. I didn't have a detailed plan. I didn't have a job lined up that would cover everything. I didn't have a guarantee that this would work. But I had something else. I had the knowledge that if I stayed, I'd never be more than what they saw me as, someone who couldn't make it. I hauled the bags to the car, my breath forming clouds in the early morning air. I loaded them one by one, each thud of luggage into the trunk like another promise to myself. When I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, I looked back at the house, the curtains still drawn, my parents standing in the doorway, my mother's arms crossed, my father's jaw tight. I gave them a small wave. Not a goodbye. Not a see you soon. Just a wave. And then I drove. The house shrank in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in my life, I felt the smallest taste of something I hadn't dared to believe in before. Freedom. Not the easy kind. The terrifying kind. The kind that means you're fully, completely on your own. And that's exactly why I knew I wasn't turning back. The first week after I left felt like stepping into a life I didn't quite fit into yet. I moved into the smallest apartment I could find, one room, barely big enough for a bed and a second-hand table I bought off someone's porch. The walls were thin, the heat creaked when it turned on, and there was a single window that looked out over a brick wall. But it was mine. Every sound felt strange that first night, the hum of the fridge, the faint drip of a faucet in the bathroom. I kept thinking about my parents' house, how I'd grown used to the noises there, the way the stairs groaned in familiar spots, the smell of coffee in the mornings. Here, there was nothing familiar. Just silence. And that silence was harder than I expected. Because for all their control, for all their cutting words, my parents had still been there. They filled the space, whether I wanted them to or not. Now, the space was mine, but it was empty. I ate cheap meals the first few weeks: ramen, peanut butter sandwiches, apples bruised from being the last ones in the bin. I got a second job at a cafe, stacking it on top of the part-time work I already had. Days blurred into each other: work, home, sleep, repeat. Sometimes I wanted to quit. There were nights I sat on the floor of that apartment, my back against the wall, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I could hear my father's voice in my head every time I felt that doubt creep in. You'll never make it without us. The words were heavy, but instead of breaking me, they pushed me. Because every time I wanted to give up, I imagined going back, walking into that house, seeing the look on his face, hearing those same words all over again, smug this time, satisfied. I decided I would do anything to avoid that moment. So I worked. I worked through weekends. I worked through exhaustion so thick I sometimes woke up with my face pressed against the kitchen table, my half-finished dinner cold beside me. I learned things I'd never had to learn before: how to fix a leaky pipe, how to stretch groceries, how to make $20 last 3 days. And slowly, painfully, things began to shift. The second job turned into a better job. The paychecks got a little bigger. I bought a real bed frame, then a table that wasn't chipped, then curtains that made the room feel less like a box and more like a home. There were still nights I felt small, like the world was too big and I was too far behind. But there were also mornings when I woke up and realized I'd made it through another day on my own. No one handed me that survival. I built it. And the more I built, the more something unexpected began to happen. People noticed. At first, it was just small things: a coworker asking how I managed 2 jobs, a landlord surprised I never missed rent, a friend telling me I seemed different. But then the whispers made their way back to my parents. Neighbors talked. Family friends talked. They heard I wasn't just surviving. I was standing. And I was standing without them. They hadn't believed I could leave. They certainly hadn't believed I could last. But now, they were starting to see that maybe, just maybe, they were wrong. It started with small, almost timid messages. At first, they were just little check-ins, texts from my mother that didn't even look like they were about me. How's the weather out there? Are you eating well? Questions that sounded casual, but I could hear the weight behind them. For months, I had been the one in silence, figuring out life on my own while they stayed in their world of certainty, believing I'd return any day now. But then the news started to travel, not from me, but from others. The first ripple came from a neighbor back home, someone who knew my mother well. She'd stopped by my new place, dropping off an old table she didn't need anymore. The next day, she happened to mention to my mother that I had turned the one-room apartment into something warm, something I had made with my own hands. She's doing well, the neighbor had said. Those 3 words found their way back to me in the form of a hesitant text from Mom that night. Heard you've been busy. That's good. Good. One word, but coming from her, it felt like a small crack forming in the wall they had built around their belief that I couldn't survive without them. More cracks came fast. A family friend stopped by the cafe where I worked one of my jobs and saw me behind the counter, running the morning shift like it was my own place. They told my father I looked confident, that I seemed happy. Then, weeks later, someone mentioned my promotion at my other job, how my manager had said I was one of the most reliable hires they'd had in years. And suddenly, my parents weren't just sending messages. They were calling. At first, it was just my mother. The first call was awkward. Her voice was too bright, like she'd been practicing what to say. "How are things?" she asked, as if we hadn't spent months barely speaking. I kept my tone even. "Good." "What's new?" she pressed. I told her about the new position. About the fact that I'd been able to afford a better sofa, that I was saving for a car that wasn't 20 years old. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well," she said softly. "That's impressive." The word didn't sound like her. It sounded like she was tasting it for the first time. Soon after, my father started calling, too. Not every day, not even every week, but often enough that it was clear something had shifted. The tone was different. Gone was the certainty, the dismissiveness. Instead, his questions were careful. "How's the job? You're managing the bills okay? You've really done all this yourself?" And then came the first real crack in his armor, not a question, but an admission. "You're tougher than I thought." For a man like him, those words were as close to an apology as I might get. But I didn't rush to make it easy for him. I didn't say, "It's okay." I didn't say, "I understand." I simply let the silence sit, let him feel how heavy it was to acknowledge that the thing he had believed, the thing he had said, wasn't true anymore. Because the power had shifted. The girl they told would never make it without us had left, survived, and built a life they hadn't thought possible. And now they weren't looking down at me. They were looking up. They were reaching out. And for the first time, they were the ones wondering if they still belonged in my world. When they finally came to my door, there were no speeches, no phone calls to warn me they were coming. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those rare quiet days when the city feels half asleep. I was sitting on my couch, the couch I'd bought with my own money, in the apartment I paid for every month, reading when there was a knock. I opened the door, and there they were. My mother stood slightly behind my father, her hands folded, her smile a little too soft, like she didn't want to spook me. My father wasn't smiling at all, but he wasn't wearing that old, unshakable confidence anymore either. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. He looked like a man standing on someone else's doorstep, hoping to be let in. "Hi," I said, leaning on the doorframe, not moving aside. "We were in the neighborhood," my mother said, her voice lighter than the moment deserved. "You don't live anywhere near here," I said, not unkindly. There was an awkward pause. My father shifted his weight, glanced at the floor, then back at me. "We wanted to see how you were," he said finally. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because there was something almost surreal about it. The same parents who once said you'll never make it without us were standing on my doorstep, unsure how to ask for a seat at my table. I stepped aside. "Come in." They walked in slowly, their eyes scanning the space. My father's gaze moved over the framed art on the wall, the shelves I'd built, the new coffee table, the neat stack of bills on the counter with my name on every one of them. "You've made it nice," he said, like the words surprised him. My mother nodded. "It's cozy." I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let them sit with what they were seeing. Every single thing in that apartment, from the chipped mug to the couch they were sitting on, had been earned without them. I made tea. We sat. At first, the conversation was small. The weather. Work. My brother. But eventually, the thing that had brought them here surfaced. My mother folded her hands, glanced at my father, then back at me. We might have been hard on you. Her voice cracked just a little on hard. My father didn't look at me when he spoke. We didn't think you'd do all this. Not like this. I didn't rush to make them comfortable. For years, I'd softened every edge for them, laughed off every sharp word, told myself their control was love. Not now. Now, I just sat there, calm, steady. Do you remember what you said? I asked quietly. Neither of them spoke. You told me I'd never make it without you. My father's jaw tightened. My mother stared at her tea. And now you're here, I said. Not because I begged. Not because I needed you. Because you came. The silence after that was heavy, not cruel, not cold, just heavy with truth. I didn't gloat. I didn't say, I told you so. I didn't need to. Because they knew. They knew the girl they once held down had walked away, built something on her own, and made it strong enough that they were standing in it now, asking to be part of it. When they finally left, my father paused at the door. You proved us wrong, he said simply. I looked at him, not with anger, but with the calmness of someone who had survived what she was never supposed to. I know, I said. And when the door closed behind them, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the child they once told wouldn't make it. I felt like the woman who had, and who made them come crawling back to see it for themselves.